something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Before the main discussion today, I want to thank all of our Patreon subscribers for their support. If it weren't for all of you, we would not be able to do this. If you are not a subscriber, you are missing out on hundreds of hours of content which illuminate the organized criminal entity that is the U.S. Empire. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Peter Kuznick, it's great to be back with you.
It's good to see you again, Aaron. It's been a while.
Yes, we don't have a transcript of our earlier discussion, but we had a lot of catching up to do, which I do appreciate. The weather here is really beautiful. It's been a beautiful few days here on the East Coast, and yet the world is insane. And you focus on, you specialize in a particular and important issue that pertains to the bigger looming insanity and potential end of civilization, and that would be the nuclear war issue. How are you feeling now about the state of the nuclear stalemate that we've had for decades with the rest of the world, I guess you could say, or at least with the East, that the West has had with the East? How are things looking right now?
Terrible. I mean, it's as if the people who are running the various governments around the world all have a death wish, but not only a personal death wish, a planetary death wish. I mean, Jonathan Schell understood this so well and talked about the immorality of people who play this kind of nuclear chicken. But as we know, the Boley atomic scientists moved the hands of the Doomsday Clock in January from 90 seconds before midnight to 89 seconds before midnight, which struck me at the time as idiocy. I mean, I thought they should be moving it to 60 seconds before midnight. And I confronted John Mecklin, the editor of the Boley Atomic Scientist, to ask him why they'd only moved it 1 second. And he said, well, we thought about moving it to 88 seconds, but that's the international symbol for Heil Hitler. So we didn't want to do that. So I said, well, why didn't you move it to 80 seconds or 60 seconds, given how much more dangerous the world was in January 2025 than it had been in January 2024? He said, well, there were some members of the board who wanted to do that, but there were others who resisted. I'm not surprised, because I did an event fairly recently with one of the members of the board who decides where the hands of the Doomsday Clock are. And this guy was totally out to lunch. So, but the world has gotten so much more dangerous. But back in 2022, when the Ukrainian counteroffensive was actually pushing the Russians back, after the Istanbul Accords, after it looked like there would be an actual diplomatic resolution to the fighting in March and April of 2022, before Boris Johnson intervened and told the Ukrainians, don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, we'll give you unlimited arms, unlimited support as long as it takes. And then the United States came in and supported Boris Johnson on that. After that, the Ukrainian counteroffensive was actually effective for a short period of time, but the CIA reported that they thought there was a 50-50 chance of nuclear war at that point. It gets much more dangerous, especially after Biden in November of 2024, before he leaves office, for November 2024, 24, yeah. After he's defeated in the election and still in office, that he gives Ukrainians permission to use the Attack-M missiles to strike deep inside of Russia. At that point, all bets were off. It was at that point that the Russians used their Oreshnik missile to hit the military facility in Ukraine. Now, the Oreshniks are not only hypersonic, but they are so fast and so powerful and nuclear capable. After that, McMaster, the former U.S. National Security Advisor to Trump, said that the United States won't have an anti-missile missile that can take down the Oreshniks for at least another 15 years. So the Russians had a major capability at that point, a major advantage. But Trump, as you mentioned earlier in our own discussion, is in some ways at least talking about the dangers of nuclear weapons again. But as I pointed out, he's doing it in a typically Trumpian, contradictory, and insane way. Because in the same speech, he'll talk about the dangers of nuclear weapons, and then he'll criticize Biden as being responsible for the Russian dominance in Ukraine, saying that if only Biden had given them permission to use all the weapons they wanted when they wanted it, then Russia would not be in this position. But it's precisely Biden's giving them the authorization to use those weapons that was taking us to the brink of nuclear war. So while Trump might have momentary, occasional lucid moments when he might speak truth, he'll then contradict it by the rest of his statements and policies, which go the opposite direction. So this we've seen is one step forward, two steps backward. Now, Trump, as we know, wants the Nobel Peace Prize. And he said this openly, repeatedly. I can't remember any other president campaigning for a Nobel Peace Prize. But I say often in my interviews that I have some authority on this subject because I'm the one who nominated Nihon and Dankyo, the current winners, the atomic bomb survivors, for the Nobel Peace Prize. And I was invited to be part of their delegation in Oslo. And I've been working with them for decades, as you know, because when you came and you brought your students to Hiroshima, with my students to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think that year, Tanaka-san, who was the head of Nihon and Dankyo, who actually made the speech receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, he spoke to our group then, as he did almost every year, as did Taniguchi-san and Wada-san and the other recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize. But the situation is we're much, much too close to nuclear war, and that we're going the wrong direction. We're heading the wrong direction. When I think I mentioned this before, but when I spoke to John Mecklin, who was the editor of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, they're the ones, or did I mention it in this interview? Now I'm confused.
I don't think you mentioned it here.
Okay, then I'll just tell this story. So I asked John why the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists only moved the hands of the Doomsday Clock 1 second closer.
Yeah, we did talk about that here then. Yeah, so the fact that they would split hairs over this, and also the inability to put it in its historical context, because this isn't like the only thing you can really compare this to is the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think, and it's been such a prolonged thing that we're almost maybe numb to how fraught it is.
Well, that's part of the frustration. There's been more discussion of nuclear issues in the last 3 years or so than there had been in the previous 20 years. I see with my students and others that when the Cold War ended, people assumed that now the nuclear danger was removed. And they were happy to think that, because as our friend Robert J. Lifton pointed out so eloquently, people can't deal with the threat of nuclear annihilation. Robert talked about nuclear numbing and the fact that after 20 minutes or so, people's minds, they blank out because it's too horrific a thought that we're actually planning for our own annihilation as a species. Back
in the context of being in a political situation in which we know pretty well through experience that our opinion on these bigger, most important fundamental issues is totally irrelevant. If they're going to go to war in this or that place, they're going to do it. So it's kind of a learned, rational helplessness and detachment at this point, and the nuclear issue is just the one where it's the most weighty and absurd that we're in this position where we think, oh yeah, they could kill us tomorrow, but too bad we can't do a damn thing about it.
In the 1950s and again in the 1980s, young people in all the surveys, both in the United States and the Soviet Union, said they didn't expect to grow up to be adults. They thought that there was going to be a nuclear war and they were not going to have a future. And people wanted to let go of that idea. So when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, 1991, people said, okay, the nuclear threat is over. I don't have to live with the sword of Damocles hanging over my head in that way, with the nightmares. You know, the surveys showed that in the 1980s, early 80s, during the early Reagan period, American and Soviet kids were having nuclear nightmares at the same rate. And so I can understand psychologically why people would be happy to let go of that, but they were ignoring the reality that we were still planning for nuclear annihilation. For example, I'll give you a more recent example. August 20th, 2024, there were 2 articles that came out that day, the same day. David Sanger had one in the New York Times, lead article, saying that the United States was planning to fight a simultaneous three-front nuclear war against Russia, China, and North Korea. But that very same day, there was an article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists saying that there are 2 schools among nuclear planners, and one school now believes that we could fight and win a nuclear war. And they said that because the stable part of the nuclear triad had always been the submarines, the nuclear submarines, because we didn't know the location of the nuclear submarines. So even if the land base and the content of the ballistic missiles were wiped out, and even if the air base fighter jets were struck, we always could rely on the submarines as a nuclear deterrent. But they now said, because of AI, because of advanced sonar technology and other advances, we actually can identify and pinpoint and preemptively attack the Russians and Chinese nuclear subs, and therefore we could have a preemptive nuclear attack on Russia and China to which they wouldn't be able to respond. We could win a nuclear war. This idea, you know, this nuclear planner's wet dream goes back to, there was an article in 2006 by Lieber and Press in Foreign Affairs, the Council on Foreign Relations publication, that said that we now, for the first time in 2006, had a first strike capability that could wipe out Russia and China without any response. And the Washington Post said heads in the Kremlin were exploding. They thought this was official U.S. policy, and the U.S. was getting ready for this kind of preemptive strike. We know that this has been part of U.S. policy going back for decades, and even during the early 60s, when Lemnitzer briefed Kennedy and his top advisors on plans for nuclear war and laid out plans for a preemptive strike against the Soviet Union, Kennedy turned to Dean Rusk and said, "And we call ourselves the human race." He walked out in the middle of that briefing. So they've always had these plans. Our friend Dan Ellsberg exposed them going back to the early 60s, 61, when he did the briefings and asked the questions to the Pentagon, to the Joint Chiefs.
Yeah, and they intentionally, through bureaucratic, camouflage and obscurantism, kept this information away from the president and George Bundy, who was the national security advisor at the time. I mean, they actually didn't even understand that the policy for anything above a skirmish would almost mechanically and automatically lead up to general war, which was massive assault on the Soviet Union to be partnered with a assault on China as well, because, may as well take them out too. And the president wasn't even aware that this was the policy.
We know that in Okinawa, and during the Cuban Missile Crisis, they had fighter jets ready to attack not the Soviet Union or Cuba, but China. So this has been exposed that this was what our policy was. Sometimes the presidents knew and sometimes they didn't know. And when Kennedy was briefed on this, he thought it was madness. But during the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the things that in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we had avoided nuclear annihilation, not by statesmanship like Graham Allison at Harvard says, but by pure dumb luck, as Marty Sherwin shows in his recent book, right before his last book before he passed away, Gambling with Armageddon, that it was much more luck than it was statesmanship or planning that we managed to avoid annihilation in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because, we knew nothing. Our intelligence then, as often since then, has been totally faulty. We thought that there were 10,000 armed Soviets in Cuba and 100,000 armed Cubans. McNamara estimated that if we bombed and then invaded, we would lose 2,500 men. Then we found out that there weren't 10,000 armed Soviets. There were 42,000 Soviet troops there. There weren't 100,000 armed Cuban. There were 270,000 armed Cuban. Then McNamara upped it to, I think it was 25,000 we would lose. Then when 30 years later, he found out there were also 100 battlefield nuclear weapons there that would probably have been, almost certainly been used against U.S. forces in an invasion. Then he estimated we would have lost 100,000 men in the invasion. He said we would definitely have taken out all of Cuba and very likely the Soviet Union. Now, the point you're making about limited nuclear war, Kissinger's crazy idea, going back to the late 50s, there's no such thing as limited nuclear war. Every time that the Pentagon has tried to war game a limited nuclear war, it never is limited. There's no stopping point. It always ends up a full-scale nuclear war. And if we didn't know it then, we certainly know it since the 1980s, that the way nuclear winter functions, as Sagan and his colleagues showed, and scientists from around the world showed, that the latest finding is that if there were a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, who were bombing each other recently, but a limited nuclear war in which 100 nuclear weapons were used, 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons were used, that could send 5 to 10 million tons of smoke, soot, and debris into the upper atmosphere. They would hit the stratosphere, circle the globe, and within 2 weeks, and begin blocking the sun's rays. So it would create famine, death, starvation, plagues on the earth, and up to 2 billion people could die from that. But the reality is that there aren't 100 nuclear weapons. There are close to 13,000, and they're not Hiroshima size. Most are between 7 and 70 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb. So the chances of any life surviving on Earth, at least large life, are negligible. And so that's the reality that we face. But they still play nuclear chicken. They still plan for nuclear war. There's still nuclear planners who think you can fight and win a nuclear war. And then you've got people like Mnuchin, and more recently General Buchanan, saying that not only can we fight and win a three-front nuclear war against Russia, China, and North Korea, but we have to keep enough nuclear weapons in reserve so that we can maintain American hegemony in the post-nuclear war era. This is the kind of thinking that we've got.
Right, and this is the sobering aspect of it. When you look back at the Cuban Missile Crisis, the extent to which we came, very close to nuclear doomsday should be very sobering and frightening. But that was at a time when the U.S. and its hold on, leadership, hegemony over the global capitalist system, everything but the communist countries, was fairly solid. And the U.S. wasn't under any kind of threat. We're not really threatened in any meaningful way today. The threat is the end of being the dominant power in the globe, as these people see it. And that threat is much more real today. And this leadership seems worse today all around. At this point, do you think that the military is actually more sober than the political leadership? Or that's something that people will sometimes argue today, that the military has changed, and it's not so. Back then, they were the most dangerous force, and you had people like Kennedy and even, people like Kennedy and Eisenhower and LBJ who didn't want to escalate to nuclear war, and even Nixon recoiled at least ultimately from any chance. But is the military a more sober force, or are they more dangerous today compared to back then?
I think they're equally dangerous. You've got General Minihan, who said in 2023 that he thinks the United States and China are going to be at war by 2025. You've got Admiral Davidson and others, head of the Pacific Command, talking about war over Taiwan by 2027. They're planning this. They are game planning war with China over Taiwan. Pete Hegseth, the lunatic Secretary of quote-unquote defense, with his body covered with neo-Nazi tattoos. Hegseth said, we have to end the Ukraine war so we can prepare to go after the real enemy, and that's China. We saw this under the Obama administration, the China pivot in 2011. Where Hillary announces it, and then Obama doubles down on it in October, November 2011. They had been pushing for this policy for decades, and to try to get people alarmed about China and the threat that China poses. And they saw it more as an economic threat. China is going to be the great global economic hegemon, given the Chinese rate of expansion and very progressive, in some ways, ideas like the Belt and Road Initiative. And people who were planning for this, Andrew Marshall, and then Krapinovich, and then Pillsbury. These are all Marshall's, really, so many ways Marshall mentored these people, but he also mentored Wolfowitz and Pearl and so many of the others. But they began in 2011 to see China as the hegemonic, the pacing threat, as they later call it. Russia represents a military threat, but China represents a global economic threat for global hegemony. This idea, in some ways, as a brief aside, goes back to what Kennan says in 1948 in that memo he wrote. He says, we've got 6.3% of the world's population, but we control 50% of the world's goods. He said, we can't help but be the object of envy and resentment. But the challenge ahead of us is how to maintain that position of disparity, how to hold on to that economic domination. And that really guided the Cold War.
And he eventually he says also to that, eventually we're going to have to dispense with all these discussions of freedom and principle, and it's going to be really an exercise of pure power.
Deal in cold and hard power concepts, Kennan says. Kennan later has a change of heart because he realizes how dangerous the world had become, and he's warning continually about the threat of nuclear annihilation. And he says, we become like lemmings jumping off the cliff, with one weapon system after another. It makes no sense. But again, we're doing that now. And not only us, but the Russians, and now the Chinese apparently want to join. Right now, there are two people, Trump and Putin, who've got veto power over the continuing existence of life on our planet. But if the Pentagon is correct, and I don't trust them, but if they're correct in saying that China, which used to have a very limited deterrent, right? The Chinese were the only sane ones. They said that even 200 nuclear weapons is enough to deter anybody from attacking China.
It's enough to deter rational actors.
Right, but there aren't rational actors.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's where the Chinese position, it perhaps is alarming, but given the state of the U.S. and what the position of the U.S. is articulated that they want full spectrum dominance and global hegemony. I mean, they've identified Russia and China as their main and rival peers. These are the main national security issues that they want to maintain their dominance over the globe forever. And so I can actually sympathize with Chinese policymakers on this issue, because the U.S. they have repeatedly throughout their history talked about just preemptively nuking somebody.
Yes, and they still talk about that today. That's still U.S. policy and NATO policy to preemptively strike with nuclear weapons. So China, which has a no first use policy, at least on paper and in principle, and I hope they stick to that, but they now have between 500 and 600 nuclear weapons. The projection is, at least based on their silos, that they're going to have 1,000 by 2030 and 1,500 by 2035, which means they can also veto the existence of life on the planet. So I understand what you're saying. I agree. I could understand why the Chinese leaders want that, feel they need that in order to deter an attack. But it's just adding another nation with that kind of capability. The thing about deterrence theory, which Kennedy said also during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that's why I think Kennedy was the last sane president we had. Maybe Jimmy Carter at moments, but by the end of his administration, Carter was a total warmonger also. But what Kennedy said...
And he still lost. He tried to appease all these right-wing forces and still lost.
Yeah.
Carter did.
Yeah. But then he becomes sane again after he's out of office. But what Kennedy said after he had the meeting with the Joint Chiefs who were pressuring him to attack and invade Cuba, he says, those brass hats have one advantage over us. If we do what they say, there'll be nobody left alive to tell them they were wrong. And Kennedy got that. That's the point about deterrence theory, that it works perfectly till the point when it no longer works, and then there's nobody left to tell them they were wrong. And the person who actually, I think, defined that most eloquently was Fred Astaire. If you look at the movie On the Beach, Fred Astaire's got two great monologues in which he effectively talks about the lunacy of deterrence theory and how it works to the point where it doesn't work, and now we're waiting to all die from the nuclear fallout that was about to hit Melbourne, which was the last pocket of life in the great 1959 movie On the Beach.
Right, and there isn't a pop culture sensibility or political kind of engagement with this in the same way that there was. And
a little bit, because the movie Oppenheimer.
That's true. There is Oppenheimer, really, which is kind of a whitewash in some ways, though, wouldn't you say?
It whitewashes the history, but it is a very powerfully anti-nuclear movie. And it ends on that note where, Strauss is watching when Oppenheimer meets with Einstein after they've shown that scene twice before. And, Strauss interprets it because Einstein afterwards is so distraught that he walks right past Strauss, and Strauss, who's the one who tries to destroy Oppenheimer, thinks that Oppenheimer had bad-mouthed Strauss to Einstein, and that's why Einstein reacted that way. It's really based on what happens in the summer of 1942 when Oppenheimer brings the luminaries, Bethe and Teller and Sibber and the other brilliant physicists, out to Berkeley for the summer, and they're doing the calculations to be thinking about the new atomic bombs, and then they put the formula up on the blackboard and they freak out because they realize that This means, and Oppenheimer rushes out to visit Arthur Holly Compton, who's vacationing that summer in Michigan, and Compton was the one who had sent them out to Berkeley. And Oppenheimer says, based on this, we have the possibility of igniting all the hydrogen in the atmosphere or all the nitrogen in the seas, or was the other way around, and blowing up the world. And Compton says, then stop the research, because better to live in slavery to the Nazis than to bring down the final curtain on mankind. And so they temporarily halt the project. Then they go back and they redo the equations, and Beta was the best mathematician, and he realized they didn't account for the energy that would be absorbed by radiation, and that the chances of blowing up the world were only 3 in a million. They say, okay, those are good enough odds, and they go back and continue the bomb project. But but from the very beginning, Teller wanted to skip the atomic bomb and go immediately to the super bomb, the hydrogen bomb, which can be made any size you want up to the sun. And when Oppenheimer briefs the interim committee on May 31st, 1945, a couple months before the bombs were used, and tells them that within 3 years we're going to have weapons between 700 and 7,000 times as powerful as the bomb that was going to be used in Hiroshima, still nobody recoils. Nobody stops it. My argument about the horrors of dropping the atomic bomb in 1945 is that Truman knew he was beginning a process that could potentially end life on the planet. And he went ahead and used the bombs, even though there was no military justification in 1945, certainly no moral justification. When Truman at Potsdam gets the full report on how powerful the bomb test at Alamogordo was, which the Oppenheimer movie emphasizes, Truman writes in his diary, "We've discovered the most terrible weapon in history. This may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah and his fabulous ark. Not a bigger, more powerful bomb, but the fire destruction." And at the time, the United States had 8 5-star admirals and generals in 1945. 7 of the 8 are on the record saying the atomic bombs were either military unnecessary, morally reprehensible, or both. The only one who held out was General Marshall, who said that the Soviet invasion could very well lever the Japanese into surrender without an American invasion or without a bomb. So effectively all 8 of them knew that.
I think even the threat of the invasion could have, that if the U.S. had any inclination to go this route, that the threat of the impending Soviet invasion could have persuaded them to surrender to the Americans, just with the tiniest bit of diplomacy from the U.S.
Absolutely. And U.S. intelligence have been saying since April that a Soviet invasion of Japan would convince all Japanese that further resistance was futile. And so Stalin came to Potsdam with his own Potsdam Proclamation, and he wanted to sign it. But Truman would not let Stalin sign the Potsdam Proclamation, knowing that in itself would probably signal to the Japanese that the Soviets were about to come in. And that's what they dreaded. As they said in their mid-May War Council meeting, they issued a proclamation saying that Soviet entry into the war would mean the death knell for the Japanese Empire, and they have to do everything they can to keep the Soviets out. So we could have ended. There's so many ways it could have been ended. Also changing the surrender terms. MacArthur, who of course was not a pacifist, who wanted to use nuclear weapons in Korea, MacArthur said in that memo to former President Hoover in late May, said that telling the Japanese that they could keep the emperor, telling them disavowing complete surrender would in itself convince the Japanese to end the war, and happily. And MacArthur says they would have withdrawn, surrendered in May, if we had told them they could keep the emperor.
And it likely would not have needed to be a formal declaration, I would imagine. Once their military straits were so clearly dire and irreversible, it could have been said, we assure you, we cannot say this publicly, but we assure you that the emperor, we have no interest in seeing the emperor.
We had no interest.
No, we didn't.
Because we knew we needed to keep the emperor to maintain stability.
And to maintain a generally conservative social hierarchy that would be conducive to the capitalist order that we wanted to subordinate them to.
Interesting. If you read the minutes of the Japanese War Council meetings and cabinet meetings, they're big. In February of 1945, Prince Konoe, the former prime minister, writes a memo to the emperor saying, "I regret to inform you, but defeat is inevitable." They'd known this since July of 44, after the defeat at Saipan, that they were going to lose the war. They were simply, at that point, doing studies and trying to figure out how to do two things. One was save face, and the other was prevent a communist uprising. They had studied what happened in Eastern Europe when the Red Army liberated the Eastern European countries, and there were spontaneous uprisings in favor of socialism and communism. And they thought the same thing was going to happen in Japan. And that's what Konoe says to the emperor. That's the big challenge of preventing a communist revolution in Japan. So they knew that. But the interesting thing is that the constitution that the U.S. imposes on Japan, written by MacArthur and his people in 1946-47, was a peace constitution in which Japan disavows an offensive military and use of the military in warfare. And the United States, even during the Korean War, tried to get them to change that because they wanted Japanese troops in Korea, but they refused. And they still have Article 9, even though in reality they've completely negated it, right? They disemboweled Article 9. And now they've got a regular army, and now they're doubling their military spending. And now Ishiba, the current prime minister, before he took office, not only called for an Asian NATO, but he called for placing nuclear weapons in Japan and giving Japan access to its own nuclear weapons, which in Japan is more anathema than any place else in the world. You look at South Korea, 73% of the South Koreans say they want South Korea to have its own nuclear weapons. And during Lee's visit, Japanese Prime Minister Lee's visit to Washington this week, he praised Trump for making America great again. You can say that, of course, he outfoxed Trump, and because he didn't want more, and effectively, the U.S. controls South Korea's military. We've got 28,500 troops in South Korea now. But if a war breaks out, as in over Taiwan, the U.S. gains operational control over South Korea's military. The U.S. strategy, if there is a fighting over Taiwan, since China is 80 to 100 miles away, and the U.S. is 5,000 to 7,000 miles away, China could take over before the U.S. gets there. So the U.S. strategy is to have Japan and South Korea intervene, maybe Australia too, although Australia won't commit to it publicly, intervene before the U.S. could possibly get there in order to try to forestall the Chinese takeover of Taiwan. But that's the kind of planning that the U.S. has going on.
Yes, I lived in Taiwan for a year, and at the time I didn't fully appreciate the history because I was right out of college, and I knew about Jiang Jiechi, Chiang Kai-shek, the KMT, and all of this, but only studying the U.S. Cold War more did it register with me in a more serious way. And the legitimacy of any sort of Western claim to Taiwan seems so dubious. The only reason that is a satellite, in a sense, of the West and not politically under the control of Taiwan is because of billions of dollars that the U.S. used to prop up a drug and otherwise fascistically corrupted political formation that was the Kuomintang at the time, that had no legitimacy in China and had to flee in disgrace from mainland China and take a whole lot of art and anything else that wasn't nailed down to Taiwan, and then become sort of prosperous and industrialized relative to China and the Soviet bloc, thanks to enormous aid from the U.S. And this is written about in academic papers. One of the main sources for capitalism in Taiwan is the pivotal role that they played in the drug trade in the early decades of the Cold War, because the Southeast Asia golden heroin, golden triangle area was the heroin traffic was controlled by a Taiwanese airline, Air America, which evolved out of U.S. Flying Tigers and all that, and this was a huge scandal. Eventually, comes out in the early 1970s. So Taiwan is just it's agreed to as a part of China, and when you look more by all parties, by the Taiwanese, by the U.S., and by China, the PRC. But somehow the U.S. thinks that it's legitimate to saber rattle over this. It's astounding when you think about it historically.
And in terms of current policy, this is really, I don't know if I mentioned it in our discussion or now, but Pete Hegseth says he wants to focus on China. That's the real enemy. Yeah. And their big concern, so they've got concern over the South China Sea, which is problematic. But it's not only China that makes grandiose claims to the South China Sea. All of those countries have grandiose claims to the South China Sea. It's not only China that's been building up these militarized islands there, man-made islands, but other countries have been doing the same thing. And some of them have been sinking ships. China's been spraying them with water cannons. But other countries there have been actually sinking hundreds of ships that come to and threaten their areas. So this is part of U.S. policy, the militarization of the Pacific, building this all up. And it's not just U.S. policy, the Brits also. There was just a British Air Force carrier landing in Japan. You look what's going on. Japan is crucial to all the planning there, and Ishiba's plans for an Asian NATO are crucial. He won't give it up, even though the other ASEAN nations have said, no, this is craziness. We don't want an Asian NATO, but the U.S. has been pushing it. As the U.S. has been pushing the Quad, as the U.S. has been pushing AUKUS, as the U.S. has been pushing JACUS, and the Five Eyes, the Chinese say is 5-4-3-2 diplomacy. The Five Eyes, the Quad, then AUKUS would be the three, U.S., Britain, and Australia. Then they got all these bilateral treaties, and the number one, if they continued it, would be the U.S. And so, but we're militarizing that area and really planning for a war. And we've been doing that going back for decades.
Yes, and the nuclear angle should be something that would force leaders to understand that they needed to have some kind of agreeable framework of international law, handling of disputes.
You don't mean the rules-based international order, do you?
Because that's the opposite of international law. That's just a euphemism for saying there is no international law. It's just what we say. And they call it the rules-based international order. But it involves a lawless sovereign entity, which is the United States, which is able to determine what those rules are, how they will be enforced, and when they will be ignored. This is so unpalatable to any political thinker with any sense of fairness or internationalist impulses.
But the U.S. would never start a war. We know that. Part of the reason why the global South refuses to go along with the U.S.-led sanctions against Russia over Ukraine is because they see the hypocrisy. because they've been victims of the hypocrisy. One of my favorite Jimmy Carter stories, for some reason, CBS TV had me on here in Washington during Carter's, when they brought the body back to DC. So they had me on doing live commentary. And I told my favorite story about the time when Carter was in 2019 teaching Sunday school at the church, what's it called, Maranthus Church in Plains, Georgia. And he says, I got a call from, telling the congregation, I got a call from Donald Trump last night, and he wanted to talk about China. And he said he was very concerned about the 21st century being the China century. And I told him I wasn't concerned about that at all. And I said to him, I welcome the China century. I said, do you know how many times China's been at war since 1979? I said, 0. The United States has been at war constantly. He said, in our 242-year history, do you know how many years we've had where we've been at peace? 16.
And who do you even know? I mean, we don't even know about all the wars that we fight with special operations, everything, covert operations of other kinds. We have no idea. We're basically at war with the whole world.
Often we are. And he said that while we've been fighting all these wars, he says spending $3 trillion in the forever wars, there's actually $8 trillion. He says China's built 18,000 miles of high-speed railroad. He said, do you know how many miles we have? 0. If we put that money into building roads and bridges and our education system, he said we'd have high-speed rail, life in this country would be so much better than it is, but we waste it on wars.
Well, I think it's dual purpose, though. I think that the U.S. also, the oligarchy of the U.S. realizes that economic prosperity in the U.S. is destabilizing for what they want in the world. I think they need a population that's kind of under the thumb of oligarchy and corporate forces, and so they let the big pharma and health insurance lobby and real estate lobby, every industry in the U.S. is a billionaire's racket. And I think that that's not just like greed run amok, although it is. I also think that there's some kind of bigger strategy on their part to have a population that is totally politically neutralized. And the only problem is, what do you do when you go against a society, which is what China seems to be at this point, that is actually trying to get the most out of its population in terms of allowing them to develop their skills, literacy, to be healthy, to have more material security and so on, to have a functional society with transportation and other things. I mean, it just seems that we are losing in every way. I say we, but I mean, I guess I should say they, the U.S. regime, the U.S. oligarchy, because what they want is actually insane and unsustainable. And if other countries just cooperate on a human level within themselves and internationally as well, it's going to be a more effective way of organizing human societies, and the technology will be better. That's why they seem to be kicking our asses, even in desalinization and fusion technology and other things. It seems like the U.S. has just handicapped itself in so many ways.
Well, you and I would have to have a longer discussion of how conscious this is as a policy. Yeah. But they're certainly doing everything you're saying. But the world is going a different direction. That's why you see what's going on with the BRICS. You see the upcoming meeting in Beijing of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, followed by the World War II commemorations in Beijing. The world is rejecting the U.S.-British model and trying to embrace a different kind of development idea right now. Occasionally, well, the U.S. is not really part of this. Russia, and Russia, not always, but China seems to be in the forefront of this. My big concern about Russia and China is that they are so fearful of dissent. I think that dissent is the heartbeat of a healthy society. And so when I go over there, when I do my interviews, I did about 150 interviews on Russian TV last year, and this year I'll be doing more than that. And I do dozens and dozens in China. And I'm always emphasizing the need for a much more open society, that even though there are very healthy tendencies in China, there are some tendencies that I find to be repressive. And they could be even more advanced, and they could be even more humane than they are, I think, in that way. Now, I'm not talking about the National Endowment for Democracy, and I'm not talking about, that kind of.
If you open up things, don't you open the door for those kind of forces as well? I mean,
I think rational discourse and persuasion can make those look very, very unappealing.
Yeah. How much did that take place in the Communist Party of China? Is what I would, given how much they have adapted over time in sensible ways and what they've been able to accomplish, it suggests that there actually is pluralism, at least among the party, and that the party, I mean, they've moved more towards state control, or we could call it public control, of the commanding heights of the Chinese economy. You had people like Jack Ma, who seemed to be like aspiring Jeff Bezos types or something at some point, and they really clipped their wings. I see that as a positive thing. I feel that the lack of restraint on private power in the U.S. is a cancer that's fundamentally at the heart of our system. The Constitution can say that the government can't do X, Y, and Z, but there is almost no limit to what private power can do, including the co-optation of the rule of law in the first place. So even the restraints on government don't work when the government's totally captured by corporate people. I don't know what to say about other countries anymore as an American, because I feel that liberalism is so discredited because its monument is all around us. And what's the response to that? It's everything in U.S. society is headed in a terrible direction, and Donald Trump, he's not the leader that the Americans deserve, but he's the leader that the American oligarchs deserve, because he is as clownish as their overall position in world history, I believe.
Yeah, well, what we've got now is the 19th century word kakistocracy, government by the worst people. You said clown. I mean, this really is a clown show. And I look at the people who he's got in there. We've got this bipartisan foreign policy elite that's been dominating the United States since World War II. And it's sadly bipartisan. And the fact that the neocons have so thoroughly infiltrated the Democratic Party at this point, that diplomacy became a dirty word. We have a 4-letter word under Biden, who was so insanely hawkish that he could have triggered World War III. Trump, in some ways, has walked that back in terms of Russia and Ukraine, but not in terms of China, not certainly in terms of Iran, not in terms of Israel. So we're at a very, very dangerous moment. And this kind of deregulation that's going on, where there's no restraints upon big business now, the corporate world, is really to an even more extreme extent than it was. I thought that in some ways Biden's domestic policy has some redeeming features there, but his foreign policy was totally lunacy. Trump, his foreign policy and his domestic policy are total lunacy. And the people in charge are you just couldn't find worse people than a Hegseth, than a Marco Rubio. Witkoff is an interesting case, because the guy's a real estate developer, a Jewish boy from Long Island, went to Hofstra, he's got 2 degrees from Hofstra. I'm going to speak there in a few weeks, and seems to really want to negotiate, but he doesn't. But he gets played by everybody, and he's got no background and seems to have no understanding. And he came back with this idea that Putin was going to give up Kherson and Zaporizhia as long as he got Luhansk and Donetsk And then he told that to Trump, and then they come out publicly with this. Then the next day they've got to walk it back because it was so far from what Russia had been saying and was willing to do. So that the next day they're coming out publicly and embarrassedly recanting what Witkoff had said the day before. So he might be well-meaning, but he's in so far over his head, and so is everybody else. Lavrov was a serious statesman, certainly very experienced. And Lavrov, who made that comment that I love, where he said, "But every time he hears America first, it reminds him of Deutschland über alles." But we've got amateurs who are there with experienced professionals on the Russian side, and we're not going to ever figure out a settlement unless we have some serious negotiation with people who know what they're doing. And it could happen. And what I say about Ukraine, and I do a lot of interviews, and I'm sometimes on with some really India. So I do more than 100 interviews a year in India. And some of the shows on Republic and some of the others like to have debates. So I'm on there with these clownish figures, or extremists sometimes. A clownish figure like this guy, Mark, what's his name? Who's Trump's spiritual advisor.
I don't know.
Black man from North Carolina. But, so extreme in their sycophancy. But you look at that Trump cabinet meeting, it's this most extreme caricature of dear leader, when every member of the cabinet goes around and praises Trump for being the greatest president of all time, and they all want his face up on Mount Rushmore. They all want him to win the Nobel Peace Prize. They all flatter him. This kind of public fellatio is so embarrassing for the people who are performing it. But they're so clownish, they're not even embarrassed, but I cringe for them. But so I'm on this show last week with the former Lithuanian defense minister, and she's going on about how Putin is as bad as or worse than Stalin and Hitler, and that the great mistake that we made at Munich in 1938, we're now making all over again. And I said to her, really, it's very dangerous to be drawing these kind of false historical analogies. That's some years back, I had Robert McNamara and Paul Warnke into my class to talk about Vietnam. And they both said that part of the reason, one of the things that drew us into that horrible involvement in Vietnam was false historical reasoning, that the American policymakers were reliant on the Munich analogy, that if there's a tyrant like Hitler, you've got to stand up to them. If you appease them, it's only going to fuel their appetites, and they're going to want more and more. And I've been on sometimes with Ukrainian parliamentarians, and they're the same, and Ukrainian top government officials. So we need to step back and be thinking a little more soberly. For example, when we talk about Ukraine, I say that I used to say there were 3 fundamental lies at the heart of American policy. This morning, I thought I'd increase that to 5 if I can remember them. Number 1, that the invasion that Ukraine began with the Soviet seizure of Crimea in 2014. No, it began with the coup. It began with the overthrow of an elected government of Yanukovych by this uprising Maidan, and then a U.S.-backed coup with Victoria Nuland.
Preceded by years and years and millions of dollars of political manipulation beforehand.
Spent by the National Endowment for Democracy to create the seeds for that. So that's number 1. Number 2 would be that the Soviet invasion was unprovoked. Number 3, when of course it was the most heavily provoked invasion ever. It was wrong, in my opinion, but it was provoked. Number 3, that it was a full-scale invasion, which it wasn't in the beginning.
No.
Number 4,
it seemed designed to bring them to the negotiating table.
and
because they couldn't win a prolonged war with them. So there's no reason to think that they wouldn't go to the negotiating table with a modest show of resolve and force. Why would a country fight a long war against an opponent it has no chance in hell of ever defeating? The Russian, I feel Putin is more or less vindicated by subsequent events, because it is now pretty incontrovertible that the U.S. was intent on turning Ukraine into a weapon against the Soviet Union, where nukes could be placed minutes from Moscow. And Putin spoke of, and other Russians spoke about these threats. I feel that this is, in retrospect, I think Putin is basically vindicated in this. Yes, he did not adhere to international law, but international law isn't supposed to be this thing in which your nuclear armed adversary can ignore completely, but which you are bound to adhere to the letter of. I mean, and there are ways that they rationalize it with reference to international law, which are, we could argue about how dubious they are, but the issue is that the U.S. really was an existential threat to Russia, and that's why they did what they did in Ukraine in the first place. The entire business of the U.S. there was to damage Russia.
Well, I would say that you and I disagree on this. I would say certainly back in 2008, when George W. Bush says he wants to fast track Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, that was lunacy. I mean, the entire eastward expansion of NATO, going back to the Clinton years, was certainly an outrageous provocation. And all the sane foreign policy experts, the Matlocks and even the Kennans and others, pointed that out at the time. And then the Maidan coup and the uprising there and the overthrow of Yanukovych, and then Russia takes Crimea. But it was clear, I think, that NATO was not going to expand, even though they wanted that. First of all, there was a frozen conflict. And secondly, there were others in NATO who said no NATO expansion. So I wouldn't go to the point of putting nuclear weapons there as you think that they were planning to do. But then my fourth point was that they believed that Ukraine could somehow claw back that territory that Russia had taken, and they were never going to claw back that territory. The point that I like to make is that it's sort of like getting old. You don't have to deal with this yet, but it's good to realize that today is the youngest you're ever going to be. You're never going to be this young again. So you should accept it and embrace it. But the same thing, this is the strongest position Ukraine's ever going to be in. And that the longer this goes on, the more Ukrainian territory Russia's going to take, the more Ukrainian economy is going to be destroyed, the more Ukrainians are going to be wounded and killed, and that it's certainly in Ukraine's interest to end this now, not to continue this fighting. It might be in NATO's proxy interest to continue this fighting, but it's not in Ukraine's interest. And that the fifth lie is that if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, he's going to gobble up one piece of Europe after another. Where the fuck did they come up with this from? They could...
Because they apparently need Lebensraum, because the 11 time zones that Russia occupies is insufficient.
I remember my first trip to Russia. I was invited to speak at a conference in South Sakhalin. And then I flew 8 time zones to Moscow. You know how big that country is? If there's any country that should be welcoming immigrants from all over the world, we're going to have a lot of climate refugees, tens of millions this coming century, which you're going to get to witness. Yeah. Russia can certainly use them, as can Canada, right, because they've got a huge land there to populate. So our foreign policy is based on lies, as it's been. As Dan used to always talk about, we lie ourselves into every war. And we've done that going back to the 19th century. This is American modus operandi, lying ourselves into one war after another. But in the nuclear age, which is why I would repudiate the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in the nuclear age, countries can't invade. Now, when China and Brazil put forth that, was a 12-point plan. Point number one was that nations have to respect each other's sovereignty. That's number one. But number two was that no nation's security should be achieved at the expense of another nation's security. So I thought that point one was criticizing implicitly Russia, and point two was in criticizing Ukraine, the United States, NATO. And I think there's enough blame to go around. Just the
part one also criticizes the U.S. because overthrowing a government is not respect for the sovereignty of countries. I mean,
and regime change, and we know this. You and I have both written extensively about the U.S. involvement in regime change over and over. And China points this out. You look at the statements by Wang Wenbin, by Xi Jinping, Chinese defense people. I mean, in my new chapter I'm writing, I go through all of this. That they talk about. And in that first meeting in Anchorage, in 2021, with Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi and Blinken and Sullivan, when Blinken makes an opening 2.5-minute talk like they were supposed to, and then the Chinese come back with an 18-minute harangue about all the U.S. crimes around the world, the U.S. interventions, and saying you have no right to talk to China from a position of superiority ever again.
Yeah.
But I think that's what the global South is realizing, and that the U.S. is playing a weaker and weaker hand. And NATO, you look at the role that Europe has played in the world. Right now, Europe accounts for 15.2% of the global economy. At the peak, what was it? The U.S. Europe accounted for well over 25% back in 1997 to 2000, when it was at its peak. It might have been over 30, I think it was 30.2% of the world economy. Now it's 15.2, and by the end of the decade, it's projected to go down to 12 or 13% of the world economy. The future lies with that, which is why I'm so excited to see the rapprochement between China and India, and the fact that Modi is going to Beijing for the first time in 7 years. Is going for the SCO meeting and the World War II commemoration. And that's such welcome news, because we really need to see this kind of rapprochement between India and China.
And Trump brought them together too. Maybe Trump does deserve the Nobel Prize, because he's going to unite the whole world, minus the white West.
That's why I'm saying that these people don't have a broader game plan, because on the one hand, Trump is so anti-BRICS, and anti-SCO, and on the other hand, by imposing a 50% tariff on India, he's driving India into this closer and closer relation with China and Russia, which in the interest of the world is certainly not in the interest of a U.S. strategy that wants to demonize China.
Right.
People as so incompetent.
I agree. The last thing I want to ask you about today is the situation with Iran, because what's happening in the Middle East, the Gaza genocide, and this issue of Trump's loyalty to hardline Zionist neoconservatives, even though he ran as the anti-neocon candidate, people know that his biggest supporter is the Adelsons. The Adelsons' money comes from the Sands Casino, which is a Lansky joint. Lansky and the syndicate sort of handled the Murder Incorporated in the past. And there's a Gray Zone article in recent years that came out that revealed that it was the Sands Casino security staff, which the CIA tasked with surveilling and even making assassination plans against Assange. So we still have like this Lansky outfit, which not only we outsource assassinations to, but they're the biggest donors, I believe, to the Republican Party, hardline Zionists, and Trump's biggest backers. Reportedly, Trump took $100 million from Miriam Adelson with the sort of quid pro quo that he would sanctify the annexation of the West Bank, which has yet to come to pass, but he has supported Israel and defended it by and large, through its, genocidal campaign in Gaza. And in this Iran war, the U.S. invites Iran to peace talks, essentially, and then while they're preparing for this, the Israelis, with U.S. weapons, etc., launched this preemptive attack, this sneak attack against Iran, and have seemed to lose in this war, and are asking for a ceasefire after 12 days. But the issue is now, and then the U.S. attacks Iran's nuclear sites, but not in a devastating way, as I understand it. Do you think that Iran is going to end up, given how beholden Trump is to these forces who want greater Israel and this kind of lunatic vision, which adds another dimension to trying to understand what the U.S. is attempting to do, given Trump's fealty to these sources and whatever leverage they have on him vis-a-vis Epstein and so on, is Trump able to have a more sane policy? And is Iran going to inevitably get the bomb because of the geopolitical realities it faces?
Well, Iran getting the bomb frightens me, not because of the Iranians having it, but because then Turkey, Saudi Arabia, United Emirates, Egypt would all rush for a bomb. And then we'll have total nuclear anarchy in that part of the world. It was a few years back when Mohammed al-Baradei, the head of the IAEA, said that there were 40 countries that had the technological capability of developing nuclear weapons. So that's not a world I want to see. I think it's going to blow up. So the U.S. attack on Iran's nuclear facility and the whole Trump role, I was very comforted to see that Trump just had a meeting with Jared Kushner to discuss what to do about the Middle East. You look what the Israelis are doing now, and the world is horrified. I mean, we've never quite seen so much of a genocide and deliberately caused famine and lawlessness and cruelty, and so much on our daily television as we're seeing it now in terms of what Israel is doing in Gaza and on the West Bank. And the pretext that this is because Hamas poses such a threat is so absurd. That what happened October 7th is reprehensible. There's no excuse for that. However, the U.S. had the plans, and Israel had the plans for what Hamas was planning a year before.
And they've also boosted Hamas. I mean, they need Hamas, or Netanyahu needs Hamas, and that's why they've financed them in the past.
Let Qatar keep funding Hamas because he wanted Hamas, because Hamas made it that much more difficult for the Palestinians to ever unite behind a two-state solution. And so Israel, even the weekend before the October 7th attack, saw the Palestinians or the Hamas backers rehearsing for it, and Netanyahu had divided the country before that with his judicial reforms. He'd removed the troops from the Gaza border and sent them up north because to the West Bank, because he was letting his thugs go after colonizing the West Bank and attacking and driving out the Palestinians. So Israel was caught with its pants down there. Hamas did impose a threat, and Hamas does impose.
Well, the more cynical interpretation would be that they were happy about the attacks.
Well,
because they've always wanted Greater Israel. They don't call it Lebensraum, they call it Greater Israel. They don't call them Untermenschen, they call them the seed of Amalek. And they don't call themselves the master race. It's the chosen people. But as Mearsheimer says, this is basically a Nazified regime at this point. And the whole world seems to be coming to that conclusion.
Well, Netanyahu is certainly the world's leading pariah figure. And if Trump wasn't such a big clown and grabbing all the headlines, Netanyahu would and the people in that administration, Smotrich and the others, are to the right of Netanyahu. So, yeah, I agree with you that the U.S. attack on Iran didn't destroy their nuclear program. Trump just fired the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, who contradicted Trump immediately and said we didn't obliterate Iran's nuclear program at Fordow and the others with our attack. We set it back maybe a couple months. And that's probably what we did. But I don't want to see Iran go for a bomb because I don't like the consequences of what that would mean. And then Israel and the U.S. would attack again because it would take quite a while before they could actually fully weaponize it and then have something that would be deliverable. So yeah, they could develop a dirty bomb pretty quickly, but a deliverable bomb that could actually withstand coming back into the atmosphere would take them months, if not longer.
But just one nuke would be enough to take out Israel potentially.
Well,
I mean, as a military, as an actor in that region. I mean, I know that there are consequences to nuclear proliferation. I wonder how much. I wonder what the capability of the Iranians will be, because my understanding was they did not really use much of their military capability when they brought Israel to be begging for a ceasefire, after 12 days. And that's just their conventional weapons. I mean, they're a big country. They have more help from China and Russia now, I think, in terms of air defense. They're enriched nuclear material. Nobody knows where it is. Other people like Ted Postal are saying that they're essentially a nuclear. We may as well think of them as a nuclear state now.
Yeah, I was just on with Ted in one of these shows, and we totally agreed about the current situation and how fraught the world is right now. But Ted, for some reason, has a Neanderthal view when it comes to the 45 bombings. He was justifying them. So we agreed that the next time he comes to Washington, we're going to sit down and I'll explain to him.
I bet you could persuade him on that.
I could easily persuade him.
I think he's not I don't follow him extremely closely, but I have not seen him. In my experience, he's not a rigid, dogmatic thinker about it.
No, even then he was open to thinking about what I was saying. But for some reason, he doesn't know this history and this literature.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to working with him. But, Iran has a lot of capabilities. And like you, I was surprised that they didn't use more of them. Pezeshkian is going to be in Beijing for these meetings. And they are strengthening their ties. The Europeans coming to America's defense are, again, even though they were opposed to Trump in 2018 for pulling out of the JCPOA, and Trump then sanctioned them for continuing to have relations with Iran, now they're going to the United Nations to try to sanction Iran for what? I mean, again, it makes no sense. But these people are such toadies, so gutless. And I am not happy. One of the last points I'll make, because I know we're running out of time. It doesn't make me feel very sanguine to see Japan and Germany rearming and being two of the most hawkish countries in the world. We forget what Germany was not that long ago. And Tom Lehrer passed away recently. But one of my favorite Tom Lehrer songs that you probably know is the MLF Lullaby. When we were talking about the multilateral force, and he talks about one of the fingers on the button will be German. And he says, he's got a verse there, says, once all the Germans were warlike and mean, but that couldn't happen again. We taught them a lesson in 1918, and they've hardly bothered us since then. So I'm not looking forward to. And Merz is such a hawkish figure at a time when the German economy is really struggling and in bad shape, and they should find, whoever. We have a pretty good idea who's behind the Nord Stream pipeline.
Yeah, such a mysterious whodunit. Really, we need Sherlock Holmes to team up with Batman or something, right, to solve this crime. I mean, who could it be?
I have no idea. But the Germans have suffered as a result.
Yeah. They tried to say Russia did it themselves. That was one of the first things that you heard in the days after. So you just have to laugh. So, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time with us to discuss these, extremely grave issues. What can you tell people to keep an eye on, or active or support any causes, things that we can do to avoid nuclear doomsday? Because you know this issue better than anyone else I know.
I don't have a good answer for that, except educate people about the whole history. Because what we're doing now is so much a part of that unfettered and irrational history. Dan made such a passionate plea before he passed away. He didn't have a lot of strength left, but he devoted every last waking minute to warning the world about how close we were to nuclear annihilation. And that's sadly the reality. What I'm hoping is that Trump decides to go to Beijing. In the meeting with Lee, Lee brought up that Trump should go. And Trump said, well, maybe we'll get a plane together and fly together to Beijing. Because the North Koreans are going to be there, the Chinese, the Russians, the South Koreans should be there also, and the United States. And we need a summit meeting between Trump and Xi and Putin, in which they seriously talk about walking the world back off the ledge. That we're just too close right now. And we need to be thinking about how we can work together to shape a very different kind of global security architecture, a global development architecture. The United States had no commitment in recent years to international development. The Chinese did through the Belt and Road Initiative. The Russians have had their own issues, but we need all those countries, and India. Modi's got to be in on this too, and the others, to figure out how we can begin working together as a way to ease tensions, build friendly relations, and have a mutual interest in peace rather than in war. And so we've got to go after those merchants of death in all these countries who are profiting. There are people who rake in the bucks every time a missile goes off, every time a drone goes off. And the nature of warfare is changing, as we're seeing between Russia and Ukraine, and now with the introduction of artificial intelligence, this drone warfare is changing the nature of war. But at the same time, all 9 nuclear powers are not only modernizing, making their nuclear arsenals more efficient and more deadly, but they're expanding them. And Trump, for all of his bluster about hating nuclear weapons, if you look at Project 2025, it calls for a dramatic expansion. We've had one commission after another calling for nuclear expansion. The Brits are expanding their arsenal 40%. The Chinese more than that. The United States is a tremendous pressure now to do the same. And almost all of them are expanding. So after all those years of decreasing, and during his first term, when Trump learned that the United States had dramatically lessened the size of its nuclear arsenal, Trump's response was, we should increase our nuclear arsenal tenfold. And it's that point that Rex Tillerson called him a fucking moron. But maybe Trump has learned something. But I look at his first nuclear posture review, and that was going the wrong way. And now he's very, very contradictory about what he wants to do. So, we've got to push Trump in the right direction. He doesn't deserve a Nobel Peace Prize, but at least he doesn't have to be the world's biggest warmonger.
Right, and the person that may bring down the curtain on all of us, or at least nominally the person. There are forces behind him, of course. And
bring some kind of fascism to the United States. I hate what he's doing.
The thing that encourages me about the fascism aspect of it and the darker side of where the U.S. could go is, with its hegemony declining over the world, and I think the days of dollar dominance being at an end, I just feel like there's no there's no point. Why? All you're going to do is have a fascist fiefdom here in the Western Hemisphere, but the empire's gone. I think it's gone, and we don't know it. We're like Wile E. Coyote. We're over the cliff, but we're just looking around like, what's happening? I don't see any other way to go but down.
Well, we could bring the rest of the world down with us, and that's the danger, especially when you've got a pathological narcissist like Donald Trump. The thing about a narcissist like Trump, he doesn't care about anybody else. He doesn't care about the past, he doesn't interested in history, and he doesn't care about the future. In Culture of Narcissism, Lasch explained that mentality. There are a lot of things I disagree with Lasch in that book, including some of the basic premises. And he showed how a narcissist has no concern about history or the future. And so it's that kind of dangerous narcissist, just like it could be a religious fanatic like Reagan, who thought that he could bring Armageddon and speed it up with nuclear annihilation. That's a pretty dangerous person to have in charge. A narcissist.
At some point, he sobered up, though.
A little bit. He did, yeah. He got scared. The day after scared him a lot. Yeah. And he realized that the Russians took literally what he was saying, and how dangerous. And we came within one word,
And who was it? Who was the official that really stopped Reagan from pursuing this?
Pearl.
Richard Pearl.
Richard Pearl, the merchant of death.
Arch neocon, arch Zionist.
Evil Richard Pearl.
Yeah.
A student of Marshall's.
Yes.
One of his proteges.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for doing this again. I'm looking forward to seeing you soon in D.C., my favorite city. Not really, but it's going to be great to see you. And thanks so much again for doing this. But thank you again.
Those guys with the uniforms are not your friends, but they're not your enemies. So, they're most of them are just unfortunate to be here and don't want to be here.
Yes.
Anymore than we want to have them.
I understand. Peter Kuznick, thank you very much.
Aaron, take care.
Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. I want to express my deepest appreciation to all of our American Exception subscribers. If you are not a subscriber, please consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Thank you for tuning in and helping us bring light to the devil's chessboard.